You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is episode 34, and this is your host, Brian McClanahan, and we're covering the week of July 4th to July 8th, 2016. So glad to have you back on the program. We got a lot of good stuff to talk about this week. And don't forget that we've got a conference coming up now just a little over a month away in Atlanta, Georgia, on the topic of nullification, which is timely considering we just had the Brexit vote. And so people are starting to think about these alternatives to simply voting for the better man for office and looking at ways to rein in the federal monster without simply exercising your vote. So come on out to Atlanta. It's only one day, 10 to 3. You do get lunch for your conference fee, so it'll be worth your time. Got a lot of great speakers, Kent Masterson Brown, Jeff Adicott, yours truly, Don Livingston, Judge Rusty Johnson, and Mike Meharry from the 10th Amendment Center. So a lot of good stuff to talk about there, and we'd love to have you come out and meet you. And if you can't come to the conference, consider supporting us financially with a tax-deductible contribution to the Abbeville Institute. Will help us keep this podcast going, the website up, all the articles, all the other conferences we're going to do. So this is it's essential for you to help us out if you like what we do, because we exist on your generous contributions alone. So that said, let's talk about the material we had on the website for this week. We started, of course, on July 4th, Independence Day, and I think oftentimes the meaning of that particular date is lost. Somehow it's become an event that's just another Veterans Day, and that's preposterous. But the meaning of Independence Day is independence, and the meaning of the Declaration of Independence is independence. And of course, the most important part of the Declaration is the last paragraph, where Jefferson gets into the idea that these are free and independent states, and of course, by states, he equates them to the state of Great Britain. So the state of Virginia is the same as the state of Great Britain. The state of Massachusetts is the same as the state of Great Britain. So they are states with all the rights and privileges of states. And he lists what they can do: conduct diplomacy, war, finance, all the trade, all the things that an independent state like Great Britain can do. All these 13 states could do as well. And we have to remember that when the American War for Independence was over, the British recognized each state independently in its peace treaty. So we have this misconception about what Independence Day is all about, and more importantly, we have a misconception about what the revolution, quote-unquote, was all about. And so we began this week with a piece by Clyde Wilson, a review of a Larry Tighe book, The American Counter-Revolution, A Retreat from Liberty. And Larry Tighe is a pretty good historian. He wrote an excellent book on pro-slavery ideology entitled Pro-Slavery, and so he is a leftist, and he's open about that. And so Clyde does give him credit for that. But the point of this book is to thoroughly refute the idea that this is the American War for Independence was somehow a radical revolution. And Jefferson, even from a lot of people consider Jefferson to be a radical revolutionary. But what Clyde points out, that Larry Tighe actually recognizes that Jefferson was not that the Declaration is not some radical document, and that this revolution, quote unquote, was not some type of radical upheaval of the political order of America. And Jefferson's only work that he ever published outside of his letters, Notes on Virginia, is not a radical treatise. It's rooted in traditional Virginia, which he defends. And so Clyde has made a point that Jefferson was a conservative, and of course this is attacked quite often. But I think if you look at what Jefferson wanted to do, of course he was a reformer in his own state of Virginia at times, but it stopped there. Jefferson wasn't really concerned about what people did in South Carolina or North Carolina or Maryland or Pennsylvania or New York or Massachusetts. And so his eye level was only his mountains. Beyond that, it stopped there. And so Clyde continues, if only the author did not assume that the natural goal of history is a feminist, multicultural, egalitarian society, then he would have it right. When one believes, however, that multicultural egalitarianism is the appointed end of all human affairs, one must assume some fault, some perverse deviation to be fretted out to explain why utopia was not realized at that time. Why did Americans give themselves over to evil, that is, succumb to anti-egalitarian opinions and a preference for order after the War for Independence? This approach depends, however, on the tacit assumption that when the American revolutionaries proclaimed the cause of liberty and the rights of man, as they certainly did, they meant the same thing by them as did the end of the millennium liberal, or at least a French Jacobin. The catch, of course, is that they didn't. And so they could have taken a different path, as he says, but they didn't, because they weren't radical revolutionaries. Clyde continues, Americans' conception of liberty arose from a solid legal and constitutional tradition and from real experience, not from speculation. It stipulated limited government of a kind not energized to pursue a feminist multicultural utopia, a thing that it would never have occurred to them to pursue, since the American people, unlike some Frenchmen, well understood that it never existed in the history of the world and never could exist. So Tice considers Jefferson the most radical counter-revolutionary of the period. He preferred self-government over egalitarianism, and this is true. So when we look at this American War for Independence and we look at the Declaration, and everyone focuses on that second paragraph where Jefferson says all men are created equal, the important part of the Declaration is the last paragraph. The last major paragraph of the Declaration, I should say. And so when we have this conception of the American Revolution as a revolution in the same vein as the French Revolution, we are mischaracterizing that event for political gain. Because the order that was preserved, save the king, was essentially the same political order that was there before the war began. And the fundamental constitutional structure that was created was the same constitutional structure that existed in Great Britain. In fact, Jack Green has pointed out that the American War for Independence was a constitutional crisis. And if you look at the federal structure, essentially, of the British Empire in 1775, it mirrored what the founding generation created with the Articles and then later the Constitution, in a union with a central authority with very limited powers. Even the Constitution, in enhancing those powers, never stretched beyond commerce and defense. And of course, by commerce, they meant essentially a free trade zone between the states, not this bastardization where everything considered commerce can be regulated by the general government. So what we have with the American War for Independence is a preservation of English liberties, which is what the founding generation said over and over again they were fighting for. The preservation of English liberties, which are being destroyed by an all-powerful central authority that was violating the British Constitution. So to look at this generation as revolutionary, it's not really. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, you can take your pick of very conservative men who were revolutionary in that they wanted to upend British control of the British North American colonies, now American states, but they weren't willing to upend the entire order of America. Even Jefferson was not willing to do that. So it's important to get that part of it right, because if you get that part of it right, then everything else falls in line. On Tuesday, we ran a piece entitled Transcendentalism the New England Heresy by Otto Scott, and this piece was published back in the 80s in Southern Partisan magazine. But and what this piece does, I think, very, very well, is equate the Transcendentalists of New England with other outlandish and outrageous practices, religious practices from around the world in places like Africa or Asia, where human sacrifice and other brutal things were part of the ritual of these religions. And so what he starts doing is equating the Transcendentalists, who started taking a very violent turn in the 19th century, with these type of religious practices. He says that Nigel Davis, a British scholar who has studied human sacrifice, observed that in Oriental and many other religions, the deity is held to be simultaneously good and evil. Such a belief places no bonds on behavior, for a God that accepts murder as equal in virtue with charity allows anything. That idea has been very difficult for Westerners to discern and to accept, for the West was founded on Christianity. Christianity teaches that God is good, and evil is the enemy. A Christian who does evil disobeys his religion. In terms of sacrifice, Christianity teaches that the need for sacrifice ended with the crucifixion. But when Christianity began to lose some of its congregation, the knowledge of these clear distinctions grew dim for many. Emerson, meaning Ralph Waldo Emerson, was one of these. He says, in turn, Emerson became the center of a New England cult that spent much of the 1830s and 1840s degenerating traditional Christianity, criticizing the Industrial Revolution, and talking in generally ignorant terms about the philosophies of the Orient and of ancient Greece. And he says, Transcendentalists paralleled another northern group that insisted it was Christian, but whose activities were equally untraditional. So, what happens is you have a transformation of Christianity in the North. And you started getting what was called the burnt-over district of all these reformers. And that reforming spirit then became political and then became violent. And that violence was directed ultimately at the South. And Southerners recoiled in this. I mean, you can look at the 1850s as a crisis of rhetoric in many ways. We've talked about it on this podcast before. How you have Southerners feeling scared because of the rhetoric that's coming out of the North, because the rhetoric turned very violent. You always had people in the North, and even people in the South. I mean, if you look at Carl Degler's The Other South, he points out that most of your early abolitionists and people who believed in manumission and all the other avenues to end slavery were in the South. Your anti-slavery societies, your anti-slavery newspapers, all of these things were in the South, because there was a thoughtful discussion about what to do about the institution. Southerners believed it to be a necessary evil, but not a positive good in the founding period. But as you get to the 1830s and you start to see this attack coming very viciously at the South, and by the 1850s this is so pronounced that Southerners believe that they have to defend the institution. Eugene Genovese pointed this out. As the conditions of slavery improved in the South, you also had a much more rigid adherence to it in the South because of the attacks coming from the North. And so this crisis of rhetoric developed. Southerners believed that they were being vilified, demonized, and were going to be violently assaulted, whereas Northerners increased their attacks and started essentially calling Southerners non-humans. And so when you have this rhetorical position, each side clashing like that, it's going to create violence at one point. And Scott continues, the South was incensed to be attacked on religious grounds over an issue formerly considered part of the political sphere. In England itself, slavery had been ended not abruptly by political compromise. A compromise was masterminded by Illinois Senator Douglas, who smoothly pushed through the Senate by Henry Clay in Massachusetts, Daniel Webster. Senator Daniel Webster was probably the bravest and best act of Webster's entire career, and he was ruined by it. I'm talking about the Compromise of 1850. The Transcendentalists rose in wrath. Theodore Parker compared Webster to Benedict Arnold. Edmund Quincy called him a lion turned into a spaniel, and Emerson deplored his profound selfishness. So you had this compromising spirit within the Congress in the old order that was undermined by the new order, what Avery Craven and others called the blundering generation. this crisis of rhetoric. And so you started getting a much more violent turn to the rhetoric and then ultimate actions of the North. I mean, John Brown, and he gets into John Brown. John Brown terrified the South because now it wasn't just rhetoric. Now they had to worry about actual action in killing Southerners. And so Southerners were not going to stand by and take this. I mean, this is so. You look at this crisis of the 1850s, and behind it, you have this moral conflict on the surface of slavery, but behind it really was political power still. As Michael Holt points out in his book, The Crisis of the 1850s, it was still about political power. Most Northerners weren't concerned about the moral qualms of slavery. They didn't like slavery, but to them, the slave states offered a block for their political economy. And so when the war begins, most Northerners were not fighting to end slavery at all. They were fighting to preserve the Union. But this John Brown raid sent shockwaves through the South. And Brown becomes a martyr. He becomes Jesus. And of course, if that's the case, if a man who's willing to kill Southerners and lead slave insurrection, which was feared, and rightfully so, because white Southerners were in the minority in many parts of the South, the slave insurrection would have no bounds in killing not only slave owners but also their families. Then what is left? If the North is willing to go that far, then what is left? So you have this hysteria, and we've talked about this on the program and how you have a northern hysteria, and this placing the blame on abolitionists as well, on radical abolitionists for rhetorically and then actually through violence itself, leading to this great war that led to the loss of 1 million lives. I mean, you have that. And people would say, was it necessary to lose 1 million people to end slavery? Could it have been done another way? Well, not in 1860 or 61. Slavery would have continued. How long it would have continued, nobody knows. But it would have continued, and so what we've done is justified the loss of 1 million lives, thinking there was no other way to end it. But that's not necessarily true. And so Scott continues, the South watched the Northernisms with fear and horror. The whites of the South became convinced that Northerners wanted their massacre to the last mother and child in the name of slaves. That winter, when Congress reconvened, senators and representatives appeared carrying guns and knives. The abolitionists, fired by the example of the new state, were convinced that all Southerners were steeped in sin and that only blood could wash away their guilt. If that ended the issue, Scott says, the United States and the rest of the world could have counted the cost high, but by now paid and forgotten. Unfortunately, it was not the end nor even the beginning of the end. And so you had this legend of John Brown created. This innovation was not lost upon watchful Europe, and especially not lost upon European revolutionaries. They saw the Western equivalent of Oriental religion rising, religion in which there is good and evil and no good without it. A religion where murder can be committed upon innocent persons without creating the stains of guilt upon the perpetrators, and where political issues can be infused with fervor of religion. A religion which, as in the ancient days, combined excess with the power of the state and made all values earthbound and achievable in one's own lifetime. Today, he says, the argument that the Civil War was inevitable reflects the retroactive determinism of those who excuse every stage they admire, no matter how achieved. The American textbooks, by embedding Brown as a hero despite his murderous methods, and hailing our Civil War as a triumph for ending slavery, though all their nations ended slavery peacefully, have created a permanent rationale for terrorism and wars of liberation everywhere in the world. And that's true. So the interpretation of the war becomes important. The interpretation of the American War for Independence becomes important. It's interesting how you look at both events as radical departures from the norm. So as we interpret these things, and history is interpretation, as we interpret them as radical departures from the norm, or as we boomerang back and say, well, they really weren't, or whatever the case may be, that interpretation determines how we think about the present. This is why winning these battles of interpretation becomes so important. So in that regard, on Wednesday, we ran a piece by Paul Gottfried entitled Through European Eyes. And again, he points out that the people in Europe, just to summarize this piece very quickly, that the people in Europe who supported the war, more often than not, were the radical revolutionaries like Karl Marx. The people that were against it were generally the conservative faction, but not even all the liberals in Europe supported the war. In fact, what he points out here is that all throughout Europe, except in Russia, essentially, there was more support for the Confederacy than not. Even the leftists supported the Confederacy because they saw in it free trade. They saw in the North protectionism. And so their idea was that, and the South made this very clear. If you read some of the documents that came out of the South, we published one on the website before by Robert Barnwell-Rhett, which essentially put the war into economic terms. It's the free trading South against the protectionist industrial North. And so when you look at it that way, it becomes clear why many Europeans supported the South. And of course, the North being obnoxious with the Trent Affair and how that shook out. So you look at European pens and European voices in this conflict, and they were almost universally with the South. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation, which made it very difficult for the South to get support in Europe, without a doubt. I mean, Queen Victoria at that point said, we're not going to support the South. But it was highly possible before that. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a brilliant move on the part of the Lincoln administration to keep the British out of the war. If the British enter the war before 1863, the North loses. Not because the British might have provided a tremendous amount of men and material, but because they break the blockade. And the South is given weapons and other things. And you might have seen some recognition. You might have seen France get involved at one point. There was a real threat with that, with Napoleon III. So if that happens, maybe if the French army comes over again, you have another situation where the North loses. So this diplomatic element of the war is very important. Just like in the American War for Independence, without French recognition and support, the United States probably doesn't gain its independence in 1783. So without that foreign recognition, the South loses. And with that blockade, the blockade was the most important component really in Northern victory. But he points out that people like Otto von Bismarck admired Lincoln. I mean, even though Bismarck was an aristocrat, and so he tended to favor the South a little more, but he liked the innovations that the Union government were pursuing during the war. And Reconstruction starts in 1862. Power is centralized in Washington, D.C., and states begin to lose their control over the general government. And that's when we start looking at the center for all decisions, really, the 1860s. So this is a nice little piece talking about how the South was generally viewed in a positive light in Europe, unless you're Karl Marx. And I think, you look at someone's friends, in this case, Marx, I know a lot of young people today love Karl Marx. Just look at the Bernie Sanders support that we had. But, they've forgotten what Marx's philosophies were and how violent they were and how awful, ultimately, they were. On Thursday, we ran a little piece by Gail Jarvis titled "A Book for a Southerner's Bookshelf," and he begins the piece by saying, recently a commencement speaker exhorted graduating students to be on the right side of history. And the commencement speaker used the phrase, be on the right side of history, to mean actively supporting social trends that are currently in fashion. He says, but the right side of history also implies that there are right and wrong sides of history. Indeed, there are different versions of history depending on the historian doing the research and the reporting. However, for the last half-century, academia, media, and the entertainment field have offered students and the public a one-sided, highly politicized version of American history that depicts the South and its traditions as flawed. Even public libraries in southern cities seldom shelve books that depict the South sympathetically. Consequently, many Southerners have had to assemble their own book collections. And so he recommends a book written in 1899 by Francis Springer entitled War for What? And so War for What? It's a little book. It says about 200 pages. Now, this book is hard to find. You can buy it, reprinted version online. There's no free version of it, or I would have, we would have linked it. But essentially, the book gets into the early stages of American history and points out that slavery did develop in the North, and that it eventually, petered out there. But that Northerners stayed complicit in the lucrative slave trade long after the institution died out in the North. And so this enormous wealth from Northern slave merchants is often overlooked. Now, there is an attempt, I think that you can say, that some people are starting to revisit, even in the North, the complicity of Northerners in the slave trade and in slavery in general, but still not with the venom directed at the South. And just the recent movie, The Free State of Jones, which we'll talk about next week on the podcast, because we're going to have a very good piece on that next week. The movie Free State of Jones is a nice example of this. And so, as Jarvis points out here, this war for what? War for What, he says, discusses the Northern misunderstanding of the relationship between Southern slaves and their masters. The slaves, he says, had realistic concerns about what would happen after they were freed. The puzzled mindset of Northerners couldn't comprehend why slaves didn't rise up against the helpless women and children left behind when the Southern men went off to war. And this is true. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, many in the North assumed that freed slaves would engage in massive and violent rebellions, even massacring the families of their owners. But this didn't happen. Instead, after the initial jubilation over the proclamation subsided, slaves came to the realization that freedom didn't include a way to survive, to earn a living. To the bewilderment of Union troops occupying the South, most slaves remained faithful to their former owners, going to considerable lengths to conceal valuables from the marauding Northern soldiers. And so Jarvis concludes, Mr. Springer wonders why William Lloyd Garrison and others in the North denounced slave labor in the South while turning a blind eye to the cruel abuse of child labor in Northern textile mills. He also questions why the atrocities of the slave trade's Middle Passage, with all its horrendous deaths, had received little criticism other than the use of slaves, instead of the use of slaves by Southern planters. And as the vast majority of slaves imported from Africa ended up in Brazil, Cuba, and the West Indies, Springer asks, why is all the hatred directed at the South? Well, because we're here. I mean, it's the easiest answer, because we're not going to direct hatred at Brazil. I mean, we don't live there. But these are good questions to ask. Why is it our history is so, why isn't it complex? Why is it we want such a simple narrative? Because a simple narrative has political points. It has political poison in it. And if you can destroy the South, which has been the conservative anchor of America from the 18th century forward, if you can destroy that narrative, you change history in the United States. And so it's important that we understand that history is interpretation, as many people have understood throughout writing history, going all the way back to Thucydides, and pointing out that you're relying on your sources, and your sources are interpretation of events. And so there is no objective history. It doesn't exist. But yet we seem to think that if somebody proclaims, well, this is the right history, well, then it is. But it's simply not true. Finally, on Friday, we had a piece by John Devaney, again, Musings of the Southern Anti-Federalists on the Presidential Election. And so he begins by pointing out that he is an anti-federalist, meaning that he's not, he would have been one who was opposed to the Constitution. And he starts by saying, the one consolation of the anti-federalist persuasion is telling everyone you meet, I told you so. Granted, this does not go down well in most circles, be they progressive, socialist, conservative, neoconservative, constitutionalist, etc. At best, some of these folks will agree that the anti-federalists were correct about the consolidation of power in the federal government, the excesses of a law-making federal judiciary, and the eclipse of the states as political societies. They would also add a hearty thank God for all of these trends. These folks are also quick to remind me that my people have been beaten down horse, foot, and dragoons. The polite thing, I suppose, would be to keep silence about the emperor's clothes or lack thereof. To do so, however, means to ignore the real and present danger facing us. And so he points out that this danger has been with us before the ink dried on the Constitution. And all the things that happened after the Constitution was written and ratified were evident before the Constitution was ratified, and how the proponents of the document did a very nice sales job of what the Constitution would mean, and then went about doing the exact opposite of what they said it would mean when they got into government and they got into power. Alexander Hamilton was a genius at this. Say what you think, and of course Hamilton was called to task in the New York Ratifying Convention by John Lansing, and said, look, you're lying, Hamilton. And the two almost fought a duel over it, because Hamilton insisted he wasn't. But if you look back at the record, and it appeared at the time that Hamilton got the better end of the argument, but if you look back at the record, Hamilton was lying in Poughkeepsie about what he said in Philadelphia, and Lansing was right. And basically what we have is a system that the founding generation rightfully opposed. He says, Dr. Devaney says, it is the current regime to which we should turn our attention. Whether you call the regime the deep state or the military-industrial complex, or perhaps John Taylor's the paper aristocracy, it is all one and the same. The regime we live under is a consolidated national regime under the control of career politicians, high-ranking bureaucrats, financiers, and leaders of strategic industries. The regime is designed in its practices to enrich and enable the activities of these rulers, and does so through a system of finance that Richard Duncan has labeled creditism. Creditism is simply another version of John Taylor's paper system. Instead of relying upon capital formation through savings and investment, central banks stimulate production by manipulating interest rates downward, which lowers the borrowing costs for both government, banks, and financial houses, and larger corporations. Private and public debt have ballooned under these practices. Asset prices have been elevated and levitated by carry trades, playing the spreads in loans and returns, and yet as of late, the promised economic growth has not emerged. In fact, credit expansion is now entering its diminishing marginal return phase. In the first quarter of this year, it took $10 of debt to create $1 of economic growth. The mega credit cycle, which began at the end of World War II, looks to be getting long in the tooth. If that cycle ends and no new credit is created, look out below. And he points out that neither Clinton nor Trump is going to do anything about this. That neither one is really for the return of state power or reigning in federal power, etc., etc. And so he concludes, for Southerners who wish to see some recovery of states' rights and local governance, the importance of this year's election is not in who wins. Neither candidate understands the crisis facing the country. If they did, it is doubtful they could formulate and implement effective policies to address the crisis. Both candidates are running on who can best preserve a status quo that is rapidly receding. So he says the best thing to do is start reading Patrick Henry and start looking inward. I think that's true in many ways. Voting for the least of the worst is a position that's not going to do anything effective. Ultimately, I mean, we don't really have political solutions left. You have to focus on your home and your community, your family, and those things can help preserve you and preserve your independence in times of crisis, which I think a lot of people are saying is coming at some point. There is going to be a financial crisis again, and the banks are running out of ammo to try to stop it. They've just basically prolonged the inevitable, which is a contractory period where you're going to have some severe hardships. But basically in this, he's saying that John Taylor was right all along, that paper aristocracy is destroying the United States. And the Jeffersonians were trying to stop that by stopping the creation of a central bank or the assumption scheme or all the other things that happened, by insisting on a strict construction of the Constitution. They were trying to stop that process from happening, and they have just been unsuccessful. And I think if you look back at interpretation, there was a period of time where all of this came to fruition, and that's economic reconstruction that began in 1862. You want to point to the part where we get to here 150 years later, it's there. The South had long been the block in these kind of things, and when the South could no longer block it, you had the implementation of Hamilton's system, and now we live in Hamilton's America. So, what do you do? What do you do? I mean, that's always the question. What do you do? And I think that the idea is to think locally and act locally. You have to protect yourself. And doing things like what we're doing here and trying to keep the Southern tradition alive, at least out there for people to talk about, the good and valuable parts of the Southern tradition, the love of home and family and community, being planted in the soil, these type of things are very important. The Jeffersonian tradition in that way. Because if there is a crisis, that's the first thing, that's all you really have to rely on at that point. And so it's important to remember that. The Jeffersonian tradition is the anchor of America, and of course, the South kept this tradition alive longer, which is why the South is America, if you think about it. At least in what's good and valuable, or as we say at the Abbeville Institute, what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. That value of the Jeffersonian tradition is what we're trying to hang on to here. And so interpretation matters. How we view the war between the states, or the war for Southern independence, however you want to call it, or the American War for Independence. How you view those wars really does matter. It's interpretation. And if you let the other side hijack and win the argument, then you're going to lose the war ultimately. And unfortunately, that's happened over the last 150 years. But things like this, our podcast, our website, it does keep a certain amount of the tradition alive. And maybe one day we'll see a rebirth of this tradition and helping renew America, as we said at our summer school. Until next time, good day.